All right, good to go. Dogs up.
And we're live. Welcome, everyone, to Undrafted's Breaking Bergdahl Pilot Podcast. I'm your host, Scotty D, and please like, subscribe, and all that good stuff because it doesn't take long or cost you a thing, but it really helps us out, so we'd appreciate it. Before we start getting into reviewing Season 2 of Serial and the alleged desertion of Bowe Bergdahl, I'd like to take a minute to introduce former U.S. Army Captain Connor Crehan. He's from the No Quitters podcast, where he reviews MTV's The Challenge along with Clem and Big Cat from Barstool Sports. If you guys haven't checked it out yet, I really suggest it. It's a really good podcast. You can find Connor on Twitter at Captain Cons, and I'm also joined by U.S. Marine Corporal Brian. So we have a really good podcast set up for you guys, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Before we start with the podcast, I'd like for you guys to tell us a little bit about yourselves. Connor, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So, Scotty, thank you for having me join you and Corporal Brian on this podcast. It always is enjoyable when you have another outlet to talk about the ridiculousness that is Season 2 of Serial. But as you mentioned, Captain in the Army, served 5.5 years active duty. I spent some time in Iraq back in 2008. So I kind of have a little bit of a background and knowledge about what we're talking about here. So as I said, I appreciate you guys letting me join, and I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Yeah, no problem. We're excited to have you. I know we've already done a drive run, and it came out great, so I'm really excited for this podcast. Brian, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I served in the U.S. Marine Corps from 2011 to 2015. I did a tour in Afghanistan in 2012. It was a little over 6 months. And then in 2013, I did a training deployment to the Western Pacific countries, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia. And in 2015, I did a no-break in service, and I'm currently active duty in the United States Army.
Well, thank you guys both for your service. I say that for probably everyone watching this podcast.
Brian, let me ask you a question. Is it true that U.S. Marines truly do believe they are the toughest out of all the services?
Yeah, I would say that is probably true, but being around soldiers now, they let me hear it a pretty good amount, so it's all in good fun. One fight, one team. But I definitely get hell now from both sides. From my Marine buddies, now that I'm a soldier, and from my soldier buddies that I was a Marine, and they say I used to eat crayons and such, so it's all good fun.
Yeah. That's all right. I got some buddies who are Marines, so I respect that you were in the Marine Corps, so it's always a fun time to give them a hard time.
I appreciate it, sir.
Yeah, it's all in good fun. So before we get into episode 1, because I'd like to go in chronological order, I just wanted to start with episode 2, though, so I'm going to contradict myself, because they made an announcement that has been making the headlines recently. U.S. Army Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl will be court-martialed following being charged with 2 crimes of desertion and misbehavior before the enemy. Sergeant Bergdahl, who disappeared in Afghanistan in 2009, was held by the Taliban for 5 years, chose to defer his plea, as well as deferring a decision on whether he'd like to be tried by a military judge or a mixed court mixed court composed of officers, excuse me. If convicted of this general court-martial, Bergdahl could face life in prison on the misbehavior charge or up to 5 years for desertion. So we'll jump back into the beginning, but I just wanted to mention that. So we got this podcast from Serial, which is Season 2 of Serial, and they got the audio for it from screenwriter and producer Mark Bowe, who you'd probably recognize from the movies The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30. He made contact with U.S. Army Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl and recorded all of their conversations, 25 hours in all, in hopes of turning it into a movie. At the time Bergdahl was captured by the Taliban, he eventually got traded to the Haqqani Network. And if you guys aren't familiar with the Haqqani Network, the viewers, it's probably one of the worst terrorist organizations in the world. they're, you know, probably not up online with ISIS, but they might be their JV according to Obama. So Bergdahl he was held captive for 5 years, and I don't think any of us are mental health professionals, and this wasn't mentioned in the podcast, but I feel it was worth mentioning. Bergdahl originally had joined he'd enlisted in the United States Coast Guard, and he went through the basic training program, and after 28 days, he was discharged for unspecified psychiatric reasons. His discharge was uncharacterized, and the next year he enlisted in the Army and eventually deployed to Afghanistan. I know the Army was taking a lot of people at that time, and who knows if, you know, some people slipped through the cracks or whatnot, but I just felt it was worth mentioning that he originally did try to join the Coast Guard. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that, or if you want me to just keep going forward.
Yeah. So I mean, you actually, you know, there's a big heavy dump of information. There's a few things that I would like to touch on that you mentioned. Number one, I think something that needs to be mentioned is that the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, are the laws that the military service members have to abide by. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean we are free of the laws that civilians follow, but we also have certain laws within the UCMJ that we have to follow. And as a result, the UCMJ is much stricter than a normal civilian court, whereas, you know, a simple assault or a simple misdemeanor charge in a civilian court could carry up a lot stiffer of a punishment in a UCMJ court. And so the reason I say that is because he might be getting some information from his lawyers or advice from his lawyers on why he wants to be tried a certain way, because he feels like he might have a better chance of getting a lesser punishment. So I don't know. I'm not privy to those conversations, so that's something to be considered. Number two thing I wanted to touch on that I think is important, and Brian, I'd like your opinion on this as well. You mentioned the filmmaker, and you mentioned the two films he's made, The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30. Now, I did not. So I'm not a Navy SEAL, but obviously serving in the Army, I have that experience. And for me, when I watch The Hurt Locker, there's a lot of things that are done wrong in that movie. And when I say wrong, I mean there are certain protocols that are not followed by the actors in that movie, and they're not how we would operate in theater. And obviously, the guy is making a movie, so he has to make it for Hollywood and make it so viewers are going to enjoy it. But there are definitely a lot of things in those movies that I felt were inaccurate. Brian, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. As far as The Hurt Locker goes, my personal perspective and most of my friends who are in the military, that's regarded as one of the worst military-related movies of all time. It's completely unrealistic. Like, I understand. I've worked with EOD, and they are pretty OFP. They do what they want, but they brought it to a whole new extreme, and it's really just it's a money-making scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think folks, when they're listening to these interviews of Bergdahl with this filmmaker, he might be trying to lead him in a certain direction that would make for a good movie as opposed to necessarily uncovering the full truth. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and again, Brian, your perspective is a great value add here because you've been now in the Marines and in the Army. Despite the fact that we were going through a surge at that time and we were looking to increase the size of our forces, especially the Army, that doesn't mean that we lowered our standards any. You know, Bergdahl still had to go through basic training. He was still trained and had all of the basic soldiering skills to be an effective combat warrior. So, again, like you said, Scotty, I'm not a mental health professional, but I can tell you for a fact that he did not get any sort of special treatment, and he had to go through everything, every sort of basic training that would be required of any soldier. So, we did a thorough job, we meaning the Army, of vetting him before he was allowed to join an infantry platoon.
That's well put. And just one thing I have to mention on the Hurt Locker, how you guys said it's completely unrealistic. I mean, I believe there was a part in there where Jeremy Renner just straight up disregarded everything, like all protocols, and, went up to whatever, take care of the EOD. And that's just completely unrealistic, like you guys were saying. And even to me, you could tell that it violates all protocol, and it's just definitely for Hollywood, and you could definitely tell that it was spiced up a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry for using some. I know my sister said to me the serial is difficult to listen to this year just because of all the acronyms. So I try to be weary of that. When we were talking about EOD, that's Explosive Ordnance Disposal Team, just basically the bomb squad for everyone out there listening.
Yeah, that really helps too, because even I don't know some of the acronyms, honestly. Bergdahl, I just want to point out, he was in Blackfoot Company, and at the time he was captured, he was only a private first class. He had only been deployed to Afghanistan for a short amount of time at that point when, he had decided to put his plan into action, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I just wanted to mention that he continued to pick up rank throughout the whole time being in captivity, and I wanted to get you guys' opinion on that, because I can only imagine how hard it is to pick up rank, and all the crap that you have to put up with and do, and for him to basically have it handed to him like that, I wondered how it sat with you guys.
Well, I mean, the non-commissioned officer corps within the Army. So now he's Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl. So he's an E5. He is a non-commissioned officer. They are the very backbone of the Army. Obviously, we have tremendous leaders as officers, but without strong NCOs, especially at the platoon level, you cannot be an effective Army. So the fact that he was given that rank, that doesn't sit well with me at all, especially when you consider it's not a case of, oh, I've been in the Army X amount of months, X amount of years, now it's time to get promoted. There's a very serious and strenuous process that you have to go through in order to become a non-commissioned officer for the very reasons that I mentioned. Because we rely so heavily on them, we cannot just promote anyone and everyone that has been in the Army for X amount of years. So it's a very serious process. So for me, it's not something that I'm exactly thrilled about.
Brian, do you have anything to add to that, or would you like to move on?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I see where it's in place where if, in my opinion, someone actually was taken captured and was a POW for, years, I think that, for the most part they would deserve, but in his case, I think it's ridiculous. I mean, he didn't do anything to prove himself to be a non-commissioned officer. Like Connor was saying, non-commissioned officers, they run the squads, usually a staff sergeant or locked-on sergeant who's fixing to get promoted to staff sergeant. He'll be the squad leader. Then your team leaders will be sergeants or, at the very least, a corporal or very locked-on specialist who's getting ready to be promoted to sergeant. So the fact that if he was acquitted, he would be handed, in most cases, a billet as a team leader when he hasn't proved himself, I think it's pretty ridiculous in my case.
I think your dog thinks it's ridiculous too. I think I heard him barking in the background. At the time of Bowe's plan to create the Dust One, which is an abbreviation for duty status whereabouts unknown, he was stationed at a tiny outpost named OP Mess. And Mess is a small town of about a few thousand in Patika Province, eastern Afghanistan. And it's located across from the OP, which is close to the Pakistan border. It also, I believe, connects to Forward Operating Base Sharana, which is where they were based out of. So they would head to OP Mess for 3 to 5 days at a time, usually, and take care of whatever they had to do over there. and then go back to Sharana, probably for longer periods of time. I don't know exactly how it works because, like I said, I haven't said, but I wasn't in the Army. I wasn't in the Marines. Bergdahl's plan, though, was to sneak away from mess, which Bergdahl referred to in the podcast as a TPC, which is a traffic control point, and run 20 miles northwest back to Fob Sharana. And his plan was to do this in 24 hours. Brian, let's start with you on this because you were in Afghanistan. Can you give us a background of like the terrain on that? And a 20-mile hike isn't a normal 20-mile hike in Afghanistan.
Yeah, if you're going in the middle of the night, like another podcast said that he left all of his serialized items or sensitive items back, so he didn't have his night vision goggles, he didn't have anything. That would be impossible. Mm-hmm. I've gone on some pretty long patrols, upwards to 10 miles, 15 miles, and that's in the middle of the day, and it takes a long time. You have to be worried about IEDs. You need to constantly be checking your map, make sure you're going on the right route because you take one wrong turn, you're done. So personally, I just think that's a load of crap.
Yeah. Connor, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, Brian really hit the nail on the head. The biggest part being that terrain does not allow you to just go forward and move out at a really strong pace. You're constantly, as you said, checking your map, and you need to slow down to do that. And you're constantly vigilant for Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and you're not just walking normal. You got, tons of gear, and even without the gear, one thing that I would like to point out, and folks in the United States that live near big metropolitan areas, they don't really understand and appreciate this, but you go somewhere in our country where there's no ambient light, it can get so dark that you can't see 3 feet in front of you, and that's what it's like in Afghanistan and in Iraq. That some nights when there's no moon out, there's not a lot of stars, it can become so dark that you cannot see 3 feet in front of you. So to think that I'm going to just walk a distance of 20 miles in the middle of the night without any sort of map, without any sort of night vision, is just completely preposterous on his part. And one other thing that people have consistently asked me is, how could he have just walked off and no one noticed? And it's possible, and here's why. So, as you mentioned, there was FOBs, forward operating bases, and those are some of the larger named bases that we have over there that people probably hear on the news from time to time, and they're very much built-up structures that have very tight security. Now, when you get into these remote areas where we have COPs or combat outposts, the structure is not as built up. More often than not, if you've ever watched the documentary Restrepo, they show this, and it's a great representation of what it's like. And they have these called HESCO barriers, and they're just these large canvas bags that are probably about 12 feet high, 8 feet in width, and they're just filled with dirt. And then you put those, in a circle, for lack of a better description, and that becomes your combat outpost. And there are security stations set up on those combat outposts, but being there, for X amount of months, you probably know when the guards are changing their shifts, things of that nature, so you know when and where are the best places to slip out. So it is not that far out of the realm to just walk off the base. And I'm speaking from my experiences. The combat outpost I was at, if I wanted to, I wouldn't because I'm not a freaking idiot, but if I wanted to, I could have walked off in the middle of the night and no one would have noticed. I would have known how to do it. So it is possible. But again, like Brian said, kid's a freaking idiot to think that this was a good idea.
That's a great point. And one thing that you said that really caught my attention, you said that you always have to check your map. And Bergdahl says in the podcast, or at least he says to the narrator, that he didn't check his compass for 2 hours. That's how he ended up getting lost. That's just stupid to me, and I honestly don't believe it, because I don't think if you're gonna sneak off someplace and you have this brilliant plan, and you have to go northwest also, that you're not going to be looking at your compass. I'm going to have that thing in my hand the whole time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're going to be, and when what makes it difficult in the evening is you can't do what we call terrain associate. So there are features on a map that tell me, where there's elevation, where there's water. Obviously, I'm not breaking ground here explaining to people how maps work, but one of the ways we will sometimes navigate is by using pronounced terrain features to know where we're going. So take that out of the element, or out of the equation rather, and you have nothing but your map, your map and your compass, and figuring out what azimuth you need to be on in order to get where you're going. So to not even consider that, again, you're inevitably going to get lost, and that's exactly what happened.
That's a great point. And he did do this at night too. He disappeared at night, and when the sun started to rise, I think he realized he was in trouble a lot earlier than that. But it wasn't long before the sun rose that he was captured. There's differing stories from Bowe Bergdahl and the Taliban, which is very interesting to me, about how he got captured. The Taliban say that they caught him they were alerted by like the Kuchis, and which are nomads in Afghanistan, and they're supposedly the lowest common denominator. They're not paid much attention, and they're not given much respect. So for Bergdahl to come into their hands, they were shocked at that and amazed. But Bergdahl says that he was never by a Coochie tent, and I've never heard Coochie before and all of this. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that, but that really interested me.
Yeah, I mean, I'd defer to Brian on this one just because he spent time in Afghanistan and I didn't. So,
Brian, have you ever heard of the Coochies or anything like that?
I honestly haven't.
Yeah, so I mean,
I was in a different province than he was. It could have just been their province, but personally, I have never heard of that term until I heard the podcast.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that. Something that caught my eye was that my ear, I guess I should say, was that fellow soldiers and the Taliban at different points in time questioned whether he was CIA because of the way he acted. Now, that means that he must have been acting extremely strange to both. I can understand the Taliban thinking that he was acting strange because they're not in a lot of contact with Americans besides combat. But for his platoon mates to say that they actually questioned that at times was interesting to me, to say the least.
Well, I think, and this is pure speculation on my part, I think Bergdahl is a victim of seeing one too many movies, because when asked, why did you do this? And he went into his whole diatribe about, I wanted my Jason Bourne moment. I wanted my chance to be a hero. I'm sure Brian would agree with this. No one sets out, especially when you're going to Iraq or Afghanistan, no one says, man, I can't wait to be a hero. Oftentimes, you'll hear stories about guys who do very heroic things. It's as a result of being put in a shitty situation. They didn't go looking for that situation to be put in. So I think, and again, the Taliban, just because they're the enemy, that doesn't necessarily make them, every single one of them, very smart. So maybe what they know of the West is only what they see in the media. So between him thinking he's Jason Bourne and maybe trying to do some things, I could see how maybe he said certain things or acted a certain way that would lead them to believe he was in the CIA. But most of all, it was really probably just due to the fact that he was so stupid to walk around without any sort of gear. They must have just assumed, well, he must be in the CIA because no one in their right mind would do this.
And he was in a dress also that he had bought at the quote-unquote Haji shop, so that's a really good point. He was a white American dressed in their type of everyday dresses, I guess you should say. So that's really a good point, because it makes sense why they would actually think that. Now it gives me a little more perspective on that.
Brian, let me ask you, like, when you set out on your various deployments, did you sit in a room by yourself one day and think, all right, how am I going to be a hero on this deployment?
Absolutely not. As you know, every deployment, your sole job is to get back and get your men back. So no one ever wants to be put in a situation where you're going to have to be the hero. It just happens that way. Some people might say right place, right time, or wrong place, wrong time type deal. But going on how Bergdahl was caught in a man dress, I honestly can see why the Taliban might think he was CIA, because unless you're special forces or part of the CIA, no American, at least no regular infantryman on a patrol, on a mission, they're not going to dress up in man dresses. They're going to be in their uniform, they're going to be in their gear, their flak, their helmet. I mean, they very well could have thought, hey, we stumbled upon this guy, he might have gotten separated, he's not a regular soldier because he's not in uniform and flak. No sane soldier would do that. Honestly, that's my opinion on what they were thinking, but that is pure speculation.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point, too, because it goes back to what I was saying about people see things in movies. The guys who have these, like, the American, soldiers, sailors, Marines, who have these, like, really long beards and kind of dress out of uniform, those are, like, elite soldiers. Like Brian said, if you're just a soldier in an infantry unit, you're clean-shaven. Anytime you set foot outside the wire, which is outside the protection of your base, you're in full gear. You're in full battle rattle. And so if somebody's walking around in a dress, yeah, that's a great point. That's probably what led them to believe that he might have been CIA. Wrongly, but I get it.
So, according to the podcast, they got in touch with some guy named Sami Youssef, who's an Afghan reporter. I guess they got in touch with him. He writes for Newsweek and other publications. And he found a guy named Halal, who actually had a very detailed story that made me question some of the things that Bergdahl said. Halal was a Taliban fighter in Paktika province, and his main job was kidnapping foreigners, journalists, aid workers, and missionaries, because it was big business for them. They could make money selling people, and that's what they ended up doing with Bergdahl when they eventually sold him to the Haqqani network. But Halal had some really interesting points. He said that when they came up on Bergdahl was carrying a knife. And this goes back to the Coochie tent thing, where Bergdahl says he wasn't there. Like, my question would be, like, how did Halal have all these details? He says that Bergdahl had a knife or a gun in his pocket, which was probably the two knives that Bergdahl had originally came with. And over Taliban radio, it was intercepted that there was an American with a camera. And Bowe was known for cameras and always keeping his camera on him. Now, I can understand that some things get mistranslated in radio interceptions, but do you really think camera is going to be mistranslated? Because I didn't.
No, and I think it just speaks to the lack of validity in what Bergdahl has been telling us. The fact that there are so many conflicting stories, so many details have been conflicting, that just leads me harder and harder for me to believe what Bergdahl is saying is genuine. I think now, having seen what's been going on around him, he sees the fact that, all right, I got to start spinning this story to help me. And, without getting deep into the legal aspect of things, because I'm certainly not a military attorney, like, I don't know how much these interviews or all this media attention is going to, or excuse me, not if it's going to be admitted in his case. So, in the court of public opinion, I think now he's just trying to save face and make it seem the most positive for him that he can possibly make it seem that way, just so he can help himself, and maybe, because I think he's already lost the respect of anyone who's pretty much ever worn a uniform. So he's just trying to save face in any way, shape, or form that he can. So, all these conflicting details, it just tells me that what he's telling is not the truth.
I agree, and you know, it makes you really question things, and I'm trying to keep keep it down the middle, and I'm trying not to veer one side or another, but I will question anything that I feel needs to be questioned, or if I just have a question for it, I'm not afraid to ask it and question either side. But for the most part, I think I'm going to be questioning a lot of the things that Bergdahl says, because like you just said, Connor, he really wants to beef up his story. He went into that Jason Bourne thing, which made no sense to me why he would even say that. And it's just, I don't know, it makes you really wonder how stupid he is at times.
Scotty, if I could just say something. I know, listen to the first podcast, I believe it was, they said that what Bergdahl said was a few hours into his leaving the cop or the fob, what it was, that he realized that it was a bad idea.
It was 20 minutes later.
20 minutes later? I wasn't sure of how long. And he decided to change his plan and start looking for someone that might have been planting an IED. So he went on saying that he was looking for, flashing lights. So from the get-go, he was all sorts of messed up. He knew what he did was wrong, my personal opinion. And ever since then, he's been trying to fix it. And he's been going about it the complete wrong way. What does the Taliban, what do they gain by lying about if he had a camera on them or what they were doing? They got what they wanted, so why do they have to lie? I'm not trying to defend the Taliban by any means, but what do they gain? They got what they wanted when they captured Bergdahl. They have no reason to lie about this. And my personal opinion is Bergdahl is just trying to find any loophole that could save his ass.
Well said, Brian. You said that much better than I did, and I agree with everything that you just said.
Yeah.
Connor, do you want to add?
One of the other things that really rubs me the wrong way about Bergdahl and makes it hard for me to believe anything the guy says is in one of the interviews where he was talking about how he didn't agree with his leadership and how all of his leaders throughout his whole time in the military were wrong. I'm here to tell you right now. Now, I served in an artillery unit, but I know plenty of guys who were in the infantry. And I can tell you right now, it is possible that maybe he ran across a platoon sergeant or a squad leader, an NCO who maybe wasn't, the nicest guy or didn't necessarily make the best decisions. But I will not believe for 1 second that every single one of the NCOs that he served under was bad in every unit he went to. So for him, as an immature kid without any sort of combat experience, to say that these combat veterans, these seasoned NCOs, didn't know what they were doing, that bothers me, quite honestly. And it tells me that he was just an immature little jerk. And something that people don't understand, too, in the military, there's a very strict chain of command. And where he was in his platoon's chain of command, it wasn't his job to question the leadership. It was his job to say, "Roger, sir," and execute on the mission. And, believe me, there were plenty of times where I overheard my soldiers saying, "Shit, Lieutenant Crehan or Captain Crehan, I don't know what the fuck he's thinking right now." And they didn't know I heard them say that, but that's fine because sometimes there's certain information that at that rank and at that point in the chain of command you don't need to know. There was plenty of information that I didn't know from my higher headquarters, but I knew what I needed to know and I executed on that mission. So just the fact that he questioned everybody's decision-making so much along the way tells me the kid's a little punk, and I wouldn't have wanted him in my platoon.
Connor, if I could go from there, when I was in Afghanistan, I was an E2, and there were a few NCOs that I did not agree with by any means, but never in my time did I think that I would just veer off and do my own thing. He was scheduled to go back to the, I don't know if it was the battalion headquarters or he was going to go to hire the next day, I believe. So why couldn't they have waited? It wasn't like that his unit wasn't doing some Vietnam stuff that Lieutenant Kelly's platoon going in and slaughtering, villages. Nothing like that was going on, because that would have been stopped. It would have been reported right away. Nothing to that extent was going on. So I don't believe for a second that anything could have been that bad. I just feel like, he didn't know, like, he was the shitbag in the platoon, and they let him have it for it. He didn't do his job well. This is pure speculation, but, you're not going to get treated well if you're, a shitbag.
We got about 5 minutes left, and I just wanted to add that he wasn't even there for that long either in Afghanistan. So my question would be, how could all these problems have happened that quickly? And it just really makes you question what his story, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you right now, I wasn't there. I didn't serve in his unit, but we'll say he had a platoon sergeant, 4 squad leaders, so that's just 5 of the, probably a few more NCOs just in his platoon alone. I can tell you right now, maybe there was 1 NCO who wasn't squared away, but the rest were. So he has no idea what he's talking about. And yeah. I'll go to bat for NCOs that I don't even know. That is a fact.
No. The Taliban's plan really was to get Bowe to Pakistan, because they knew once they got him to Pakistan that they could take their time negotiating a deal that they wanted to negotiate. And the United States knew this. So what the Taliban did, and I mean, I'm going to give them credit for this because I think it's smart. They were playing chess, and I mean, I'm not going to say the United States was playing checkers, but the Taliban went west originally, so away from Pakistan, and then brought him north and eventually snuck him across the border. But there were times, they said in the podcast, that that the United States was very close to Bergdahl, and the Taliban would say they'd get intercepts on the radio saying, hey, we're really close to the United States here. That the soldiers, they're on our ass. They've just either kicked in a door a few hours later that he was actually in, or we're just holding him in a place that's very close. And it just goes to show how good U.S. intelligence is. They were on the Taliban's ass from the start, and even though they stayed one step behind that whole time, it's very easy to lose that track, I guess. And I think it was amazing that the United States was able to keep playing chess while the Taliban was making great moves the whole time. I mean, I guess we can wrap everything up here. I know a few people are short on time. Is there anything else that you guys want to add to this podcast?
Brian, do you have anything?
I'm pretty set with how we stand right now.
Yeah, I think one thing I guess I would want to impress upon everyone is I think Koenig is trying to tell this story in such a way to sympathize with Bergdahl, and as a result get our listeners to sympathize, like, oh, woe is this guy, he had 5 years in captivity. Yeah, that's terrible. That probably sucked. I'm not taking anything away. That definitely had to suck. But there are plenty of people who spent time in captivity and did it the right way. There was a right way and a wrong way to do it. And I think he did some dishonor to the uniform and to our country by the way things shook out and by the way he got himself into the situation. So just remember when you're listening to her tell the story that she's telling it from one side and she's trying to get people to listen to her podcasts on a now bi-weekly basis. So just take it with a grain of salt, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them offline on Twitter, on DMs, or just hit me up, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have, even if it's just, what does this acronym mean? But
that's well said. That's well said, Connor. You can find Connor on Twitter at Captain Cons, and like I said before at the beginning of this podcast, check out the No Quitters podcast because it's really good. They just had TJ Lavin on a few weeks ago. He's the host. and that was a great episode, as well as this last episode. I really enjoyed those two of the No Quitters podcast. And yeah, I guess that's it for us here. You can find me on Twitter at Depot12S. And from there, I guess we'll try to knock off either episode 3 next, or maybe do 3 and 4. We'll figure that out, and we'll be back, guys. We're going to follow this podcast to the end.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Scotty. Thank you for allowing me once again to come on. And Brian, it was nice to have you on and your perspective, because obviously you and I share different perspectives, being on either side of the spectrum, being that officer and enlisted. So I hope you don't hold that against me, but I enjoyed talking to you.
It's a pleasure.
That's awesome, guys. No, I really appreciate you guys coming on here, because, like, I could come on here and talk a big game, but I haven't been there and done that. And to have the perspective that you guys bring on here is really awesome. So thank you guys for coming on.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
All right, guys, that's it for Undrafted. You can catch us at Undrafted on Twitter. It's the E at the end is a 3. Just get that right. And or you can either DM me or Connor, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. So thank you, guys, and until the next time, I guess, peace.